You're watching Inside the Right. As always, I'm joined by my co-host, longtime Republican operative Tim Miller, who's here to give us a better look about what's happening on the right. So, Tim, the Iowa caucus is behind us. Donald Trump won with about 50%. Ron DeSantis was in second with Nikki Haley in a close third. Trump only got 50%, though, in a primary for a party that he supposedly owns, basically with the advantage of the incumbency in a very white, very Christian state. Is that an issue for him?
Yeah, there are two ways to look at it. One is through the Republican Party primary construct, and one is to the general election, right? So, to your question, I do think it's an issue for him in the general election, and there were some silver linings for Joe Biden last night. Number one, the turnout in Iowa was extremely low. Now, the weather was cold. Some of it could have been that. Some of it could have been that it seemed like a blowout, so people didn't feel like they had to show up. But even still, 56,000 fewer people showed up than in 2016. Trump supposedly has added people to the party since 2016. At least that's what the MAGA folks will have you believe.
Right.
And yet the turnout number goes down. So I think that's something to watch. Maybe is the energy of his base a little bit dampened. And then, as you said, there was about 50% that didn't vote for him. Now, some of those voted for Vivek and some of them, and DeSantis gets second, right? So he probably coalesces that group. The Haley vote, though, if you look at the entrance polls, which we'll talk about, was quite hostile to Trump. And I think that is another problem, warning sign for Trump for a general election, right? This is not the Chris Christie vote. Like we knew those folks would probably end up with Biden, right? But for the Haley vote to be so hostile to Trump, I think is a problem for him. So that is one way to look at this, that it's a negative for him in the general election. I do have to say, though, in a primary, I get that he has the advantage of being a former president, et cetera. But the biggest Iowa caucus victory ever before last night was 12 points. And he won by 29 and a half. And he won every county except one that Nikki Haley won by one vote,
Right.
Johnson County, where the University of Iowa is. So, I think that he still has a stranglehold on this party. And I think that's still pretty clear after last night.
Now, you mentioned those Nikki Haley defectors. That was also kind of reiterated in the recent Ann Seltzer poll, showing that 11% of Republican respondents to that poll, which is considered the gold standard of polling, at least in Iowa, said that they would vote for Joe Biden. If even half of that number holds true, like if even 3% of those defectors remain, and Trump is losing several percentage points of his own party's base. Like, forget about expanding his tent into those independents and suburban moms and the moderates out there. If he's losing 3% of the base, then isn't that kind of game over for him in a general election where he can't afford to lose anyone, much less the people that should be surefire Republicans?
Yeah, well, I don't want to say it's game over because you don't know what's happening on the Democratic side. There's some
Right.
warning signs with young voters. There's some warning signs with voters of color, right? So maybe that 3% gets offset. 11% is pretty hard to offset, though. Okay, so that 11% number, I do think is something to watch, and how close can Biden get to that? And I think that that's going to be a big thing we talk about all year, and a big group, right? Like, so does that Nikki Haley vote over the course of a campaign? Do they get more disgusted by Trump, or do they kind of go back to their natural partisan priors, right? And that's going to be a big battleground for this election. I think there's a good reason to believe maybe they get more grossed out by Trump, and I think that's why I'm kind of holding out making grand pronouncements about the national polls until about March. I want to see what happens once it really sinks in. I think about some of my friends. When I used to be a Republican, not the professional Republicans, they know it's better, but just like my buddies, my college buddies, right? It hasn't like they're all George W. Bush, Mitt Romney voters. It hasn't sunk in for them yet that Donald Trump's really going to be the nominee again. Like they are still texting me like Nikki's going to come back, right? And so when those types of voters are being asked by pollsters what they're going to do, I don't know if the reality of this race, has really sunk in, and they're giving this answer they'll give in November. So I think we'll learn a lot more about that kind of 11% of the Nikki Haley voter that's a Republican partisan, but is not, MAGA, not super engaged. I think we'll learn a lot more about where they're at once she's officially out of the race, which I think is kind of inevitable.
Well, okay. To this point of like the longer that I guess Nikki Haley is in, the more opportunity there is for her supporters to kind of engage in this hostile, drawn out primary. The results that we saw yesterday, does that make it more likely or less likely that this primary is drawn out as far as Nikki Haley her presence in the primary is concerned.
I think slightly less likely, but really it all comes down to New Hampshire for her. If she gets crushed in New Hampshire, I think that she's going to have some, a very deep look inside about whether she's up for the pain of a full month, right? It's only a week between Iowa and New Hampshire. It's a full month between New Hampshire and South Carolina. Trump calling her bird brain. Trump brought back out birtherism, targeting her, because her parents were immigrants, right? Like just these personal attacks that will go on her
Donald
family.
Trump, who famously has no connections to immigration, not like he's married to somebody who literally wasn't born in this country.
All of them, I think
Yeah.
all the wives, maybe two, at least two. So, I think that she'll have to decide whether she's up for that now. But if she does really well in New Hampshire, it's going to be really hard to get out. I just thinking back to my own experience with Jeb in 2016. It was the writing was on the wall pretty clear right after New Hampshire that we weren't going to be the nominee. But, still, it's like his brother did well in South Carolina. You talk yourself into it. You want to go down there. Let's give it a shot. Let's give it one more shot before we pack it in, right? There's this inertia. There's pressure of your donors and your friends wanting you to stay. So, and then even after South Carolina, Jeb had some friends around him that wanted to stay. And, especially in the campaign, and Jeb himself was like, okay, I need to accept reality here. So, Nikki, I think there'll be if she gets close in New Hampshire, definitely if she wins, there'll be a lot of pressure on her to stay. I think the result yesterday maybe marginally hurts her, just in the sense that she didn't get the momentum bump that she was hoping for. I don't think it did anything to actively harm her, but she didn't get the slingshot that she wanted that might carry her to a New Hampshire victory. And I think that if Trump does end up winning, let's say, if like last night, right? Let's say it's a 51-21 thing again, I think that she would obviously get out.
Okay. I want to go back to one more set of numbers that I think stuck out at me, and that was the ABC entrance poll showing that 31% of caucus goers think that a conviction would mean that Donald Trump isn't fit to be president. Dude's going to be convicted in at least one of the 4 criminal trials that he's contending with right now. Even if there's some reversion to the mean, and only 10%, for example, think that it's disqualifying. I mean, we spoke about this earlier. Is that not a death knell for Trump in the general election?
That would obviously be a death knell. That's a concerning number. Again, do those things change? Once you're asking people to respond to a hypothetical, right?
Right.
And might they change their view based on what's happening in real time? Sure. And do the Trump trials actually happen? This is where we got to bring Glenn Kirshner into the conversation. Do they actually happen before the election, right? So, I don't know. I think that, again, though, the thing that is the most concerning if you're Trump, and the most encouraging for those of us that are desperate for Donald Trump to never be in the fucking White House again, is that's, again, that is a pretty healthy number of the Republicans. It's the party is still Trump's, right? It's not enough to take the party back from him. Like, the party is still corrupted. But as a general election matter, I was kind of surprised at the entrance polls at just how hostile the Haley support group in particular, and even a small percentage of the DeSantis support group, was to Trump. And that's a big problem. I think that's why you saw in his announcement, or in his victory speech, his very weird victory speech, like in Trump in his own way, he tried to be conciliatory. There was no bird brain, there was no de sanctimonious. He was talking about how all that was in good fun in his speech. And I think that's because Trump knows, they saw the numbers too, that's a big problem for him if he can't get those people back into the fold.
By the way, for anybody watching right now, if you want to hear more from Tim beyond our Inside the Right series, please make sure to subscribe to The Bulwark. That's Tim's YouTube channel that he posts on throughout the entire week. So if you're not yet subscribed, I'll put the link right here on the screen and in the post description of this video. It's the best way to support Tim and his work. Tim, is this ultimately a fool's errand? Like, even if Haley or DeSantis overperform in any of these early states, Trump is going to win out. So other than just kind of watching the horse race for the sake of watching the horse race and having something to talk about, isn't everybody just kind of lying to themselves because we know what the ultimate result out of all of this is going to be?
There's a lot of phoniness happening in the punditry class, and I think there's a lot of wish casting. A lot of political reporters, horse race reporters, want this to be a race. A lot of establishment Republican types, even on Fox, want this to be a race, right? And so, people are squinting, trying to find out a narrative that's something other than the reality, which is, that Trump is winning this in a landslide. And the whole thing last night to me was kind of depressing, given that it's my former party. And it felt like a show election. It felt like an election in a third world country, right? Where you like have one real candidate and then a couple fake candidates.
Yeah.
Like they're not even campaigning against him. Like they didn't even really try. They lost by 30. So I think that this is inevitable, and you'll get a lot in the next week of people trying to make hypothetical cases for Haley based on a victory in New Hampshire. Here's the problem. A victory in New Hampshire for Haley will be powered by undeclared voters and Northeastern moderates. And there just aren't any other states like that. Like New Hampshire has very unique rules. If you're not a registered, if you're an independent, you can just go in and vote on either side. There's no Democratic primary. And then New Hampshire still has some like people that are in the Boston suburbs, so kind of old school, moderate Republican types. Like, there's no other states like that. So, like, it is not a path to winning the nomination, even if she wins New Hampshire. If your strongest group is people that aren't really Republicans, right?
Yeah.
Like if you're winning a primary based on the power of undeclared voters, it's hard to put that back together in another state. And so you end up with people doing this thing that's like, well, okay, Nikki Haley wins New Hampshire, then question mark, question mark, question mark. It changes the momentum and something, 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 and then she wins. It's all a little fanciful.
Yeah. Now you watched the Iowa caucus returns from the New York Young Republicans Club. Can you kind of what was that experience like? Was there anything unusual that happened there?
Yeah, I did. I was doing some MSNBC rounds, and in between, I went over to they have a speakeasy. The New York Young Republicans have a speakeasy, um, which they opened during COVID because they wanted to be able to gather against the rules of New York.
Right,
So
right.
that tells you the kind of group that we're dealing with
Right,
here.
right.
It was interesting just in that, like, it was this microcosm of what's happened to the Republican Party. The New York Young Republican Club has been taken over by MAGA. We did another video earlier about the gala that they had that had all the crazy far right folks there. Um, and yet there's still some people who kind of are part of this old Republican Party that doesn't exist anymore that like wanted to go to a social gathering on caucus night. And so like they like attended this thing. And so it was funny to see this dichotomy of this like very MAGA group. Trump wins the venue, erupts and Trump, Trump, Trump. Like I overhear somebody talking about, I can't believe how 18% of the party are neocons that want to bomb Iran, referencing at the time Nikki Haley had 18% of the vote, right?
Yeah.
That's what a lot of people talking about being red pilled around me. That is like the mood of this group. And then you had like 3 or 4 people who were like, Nikki Haley supporters. They're like, wait a minute, I was just here to network with other people that like tax cuts. And like that's kind of what the party is, right? And so just seeing that in a social dynamic about younger voters, I think there's a lot of people that don't really that think that the Trump base is all these old, kind of dying boomer types. And like that's not really true. Like a lot of people that are younger than in their early 20s who are Republicans came of age in the Trump era. And they have chosen this. They like this. Like they've opted into the MAGA Trump party. And they were all very excited by Trump's win last night, very hostile to Haley. And you could kind of sense in the room, just like in a social setting, you could sense in the room that the Haley people are kind of uncomfortable. They're like, wait a minute, this isn't our party anymore. Like if I would have come to this party 12 years ago during Mitt Romney's caucus win, it would have been all kind of, people drinking milk and wearing wearing suits. You know what I mean? It was a very different vibe.
Yeah.
And you could sense it in the room. And I think that was just this, like I said, this microcosm of what's happening with the party.
And so what do you think happens if it ends up for one reason or another, if he's convicted, if he can't serve, if he, if something health-wise happens to him, what happens to those people who share no allegiance with the rest of the Republican Party as far as policy is concerned? They're there for the cult of personality that is Donald Trump. What happens to those people moving forward?
Yeah, I asked a lot of them that. And there's a small group of people for whom this is a team jersey thing. Some of them it's just team jersey. It's like whatever, Trump goes away, whoever else they put up next time, I'll
Right.
put on that guy's jersey. And it's like I just want to own the libs, right? Like that's some element. But then there is just a big core of younger voters that have embraced the Trump agenda of culture war, of very harsh immigration policies, and of more isolationist foreign policy. And they're going to be looking for somebody that wants that. And my view is that's a majority of the party now. Maybe not a huge majority, maybe it's a slight majority. I think that the Republican Party will definitely have an identity crisis if Trump is to lose again or get it or go to jail, God willing, or die. But I still think that that MAGA group will still be the majority group within the party. And whether there'll be somebody else that can galvanize that group, I don't know. But for example, one of my favorite questions to ask those people is, so okay, it's 2028. Work with me here, and let's say it's Haley and Elise Stefanik and Tucker. Who are you with? It's like Tucker. Like Tucker. Like Haley, JD Vance, or Tucker. And it's like, ooh, maybe JD Vance or Tucker, right? Like that's who these folks want, right?
Yeah.
They're not going to go back.
Right. And by the way, the writing is on the wall for the candidates too. Like there is a reason Vivek did what he did. Like there's a reason that he chose the lane that he chose. There's a reason that Ron DeSantis chose the lane that he chose, even if he's weird and kind of has to a little bit fight back against the only person standing between him and the actual nomination. Like they see the writing on the wall that this is like a MAGA party now, and that they have to espouse that to some degree if they want to have any success, whether it's now or in 2028 or in the future.
And just add them up in Iowa, right? So again, on the one hand, it's like, well, Trump's it's a little disappointing that if it's a cult and he only has 50% and he used to be the president, right? That shows some weakness. That's on the one hand, that's true. But it's also true that if you add up Trump and DeSantis and Vivek, who were the three worst nominees, in my opinion, right? If you looked at the whole field from the start, you had Tim Scott and Mike Pence and Nikki, Chris Christie. If you're going to rank the three most MAGA, Vivek, DeSantis, and Trump, they added up to what, 77?
Yeah.
3/4 of the party. And I just think that tells you like the real state of play within the Republican Party right now.
All right. Well, now we look forward to New Hampshire. And again, if you want to see more of Tim and his commentary, make sure to subscribe to The Bulwark. Again, I'll put the link on this screen and in the post description. Best way to hear from Tim and to see more of his work throughout the week. With that said, I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Tim Miller.
This is Inside the Right.